All right. And today we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. We have 10 people, which is awesome. We're going to be talking about emotions. And originally I was going to try to talk about emotions like across the lifespan. But I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop around the adolescent time, because next class I'm going to spend the whole time on adolescence. And so I'm going to talk about a lot of different things, including emotional development in adolescence. And so I'm going to talk about two different things. The first thing is just kind of a general discussion of emotions, just what they are. And when I say general, I mean super general, as in here's some basic information about them. Here's what they are. Here's what they're not, in terms of like a primary emotion, a secondary emotion. I'm gonna talk a little bit about like a cycle of like what that looks like if you get triggered in some way. We're going to talk about that. That's one piece. The second piece will be kind of like the genesis of how emotions are started and how they develop and how they develop all the way through until adolescence, and the roles that adults play in kids' lives when it comes to emotional development. When we get to the adolescent part, we'll talk about the exact same thing, how emotions kind of play a role in their life in adolescence, and how the adults in their life play a role inside of those emotional development. We'll do the same thing when we talk about adolescence. I'm just kind of giving a heads up. I'm super passionate about this topic, and I talk about it because most, if not like 90% of our work with people, we're going to be in this realm of emotions. And so what I have found to be helpful is and this is probably more my learning style and my personality. I just kind of dive in and learn as much as I can about something. And so like recently, I just got this huge book. My wife's laughing at me, but this is called, it's hard to see with this stupid background. Hang on. How Emotions Are Made. I'm gonna turn this background off. It's pretty interesting because it came recommended to me by a few people, and so it's like a textbook, so it looks a little bit daunting, but I'm going to start reading this because I'm really fascinated by emotional development, and mainly because I work with emotions so much with people, and nobody's the same. Everybody's different, even though we emotionally, like developmentally, we all kind of develop the same way emotionally, physically, cognitively, but how we express them can be so different. And so
Can I
that's
ask a
probably like,
question?
yeah, sure.
Who's the author?
Lisa Feldman Barrett.
Okay, thank you.
I have zero idea if it's any good. I don't know anything that much about it other than I've seen it, and I've seen some folks that I follow talk about it. And it's super thick. I don't know if you can tell, but it's like, I don't know why I picked this up. I'm so busy right now. I don't have time to read that, but I'm gonna read it anyway. But I feel like our emotional development, we just don't do it. We also just don't do a good job of talking about emotions, and we don't do a good job teaching about them. And in some ways they're icky. I guess I don't know. There's something about it that just so there's code words, right, that we use sometimes, like, oh, you're too emotional, or don't get emotional, and it doesn't really mean what it's like code for don't cry usually, or code for don't get mad or whatever. Instead of saying, hey, you seem upset, or are you frustrated right now, or like being specific and asking, because we just feel uncomfortable. And emotions are uncomfortable, and it's one of the more uncomfortable things we will experience. But thoughts can be just as uncomfortable, and thoughts and emotions are very, very closely tied together. So, having said that, I'm going to walk us through just some general information. Then we're going to talk about from childhood up into adolescence, and then I'm going to talk at the end, kind of like a triggering event, what happens, what it looks like, And then I'm going to try to work on towards some coping mechanisms and coping skills to help. So we're going to try to be as practical as we can. All right, I'm going to get my screen here. Everybody see that, hopefully? Excuse me. I also like to get everybody's picture up so I can see everybody. Okay. I apologize, my dog's about to bark, but we'll just move on. Okay, first thing we're going to talk about, and I just actually went online today and kind of picked a couple of slides from a couple of places I know. And this is just super general overview, right? Actually, my screen, my background right now is an emotion wheel. I actually give emotion wheels to some of my clients that struggle with expressing emotion or don't know how to express it. Sometimes you just need to give people words like emotional, like they can put the meaning behind them. So like the last class, we talked a lot about guilt and pride, shame. We talked about some of those. Those are typically secondary emotions. And so primary emotions are like your anger, your love, your joy, your fear, your sadness. So if you think about it this way, primary is at the bottom of the foundation. And those are usually like that gut level, instant emotion you experience. The secondary emotions are the things that are expressed typically, the things that come out that you see, okay? Because we don't like fear, like we don't like to feel it. So it might come out as depression or disappointment. Okay, they're all valid, but in a lot of ways, until you can get to the primary emotion, you can't soothe adequately until you're down there. And so this is just one kind of example. And I'm going to put these slides up online so you guys don't have to feverishly take notes. So I'll give you an example. Let's talk about anger, because I talk about anger daily with my clients and my kids and my niece and nephew and my family and everybody, because we all have anger. So funny story, about 9 years ago, I was working at a facility running a group for men and women that had just been released from federal prison. They were on probation. And so we were running a group, and the topic we were on for 3 weeks, we were talking about anger, technically anger management, which you really don't manage anger. We actually manage the behavior, but so we introduced anger. We were just kind of talking about it. We were going through, and this guy in the room basically raised his hand and was like, hey, I don't know why we're talking about this, because I don't get angry. And so my friend Amber, who was leading the discussion, just kind of sat back and said, what do you mean? And so, well, I just don't get angry. And she said, well, you don't get upset about something. She's like, no, I never get angry. And she just asked a couple more questions, and not defensively, just kind of trying to understand. And the more she asked, the angrier he got, and the more his voice was raised. And then all of a sudden he was yelling, and someone right beside him was like, dude, you're angry right now. And you're like, what, But that's kind of what happens sometimes with especially things like anger. We don't know it's happening sometimes until it happens. And so I use this often when I talk about anger, because the idea of an iceberg is that the anger part, or the expression of behavior, where we're talking about words or actions, like if I throw my phone, or if I yell at someone, or if I slam a door, or if I just get silent, those can all be expressions of anger. But really what it might be is I might feel rejected, or I might feel nervous, or I might feel envious or offended. So all of these things below the surface, it's kind of like what sank the Titanic wasn't what they saw, they saw the iceberg, they just didn't see underneath. And so a lot of anger comes out because we don't know a better way or more productive way or more positive way to express hurt or worry or rejection or nervousness. Instead, it comes out as anger. And that's especially true when we're younger, and that makes sense because we don't know, we either don't have coping, or we're told what? Stop. Don't be angry. So if I say to you, don't be angry, what am I saying?
Don't have that emotion. Like stop.
That's right.
Stop having emotions at all.
Yeah, stop being overwhelmed. Stop being embarrassed.
I think a lot of times too, when we tell someone to stop expressing an emotion, what we're really telling them is your expression of emotions making me uncomfortable. Can you not do that?
Absolutely. Great point. So a lot of times it's like, I don't like this, so therefore you don't need to do it. Instead of, I wonder what's going on, what's happening. Right? And in some ways we're narcissistic about anger and emotions in general because we make it about who? Us, and not them in some ways. And so the quicker we can become comfortable with emotions, the quicker we can become comfortable with other people's emotions. And that's one of the things that really helps. So this is just an example of anger, like anger in terms of like a primary and secondary kind of how it works. Okay. I'm going to go through a couple of these fairly, not kind of quick, but I'll try to do my best to explain them. We talked about pride and shame, embarrassment, guilt last time when we were talking about kids. We kind of went through some of these things already, and we know that some of these emotional reactions are important for their development. So it's not like we're trying to shut them down. Again, we're not trying to shut down emotions. For number one, you can't. They come out anyway. Even if we work hard at suppressing emotions, which we can do, you can practice suppressing your emotions. The problem is that when you suppress emotions, you suppress all of them, the negative and the positive. And then we become emotionless, which I have had many clients over the years that will even say, I just don't feel anything. I don't have that emotion, or I don't express it that way. And when I say clients, I don't mean people that might have like a disorder, like say maybe on the spectrum where it is hard to recognize some of those emotions. But even if you're on the spectrum, you can still recognize and learn how to see when those emotions are coming out. Some people just spend time in their life putting them in silos so that they don't have to experience them. A lot of reasons why we have some of the issues we have are because people just don't like feeling emotions. So we'll do whatever we can not to feel them. And so sometimes that starts happening early in life. And it's mainly influenced by a parent's response to a behavior. So, and I said this last time, and I mean it this time, whenever we talk about things in like developmentally speaking, I tell my clients this all the time. If I want to learn something about your childhood, I'm not trying to learn something so we can bash your parents or your grandparents or your uncles or aunts. This is not about them. Now, because no parents, first of all, nobody's perfect. No parent's perfect. Everyone makes mistakes. This isn't about like, let's have a session where I bring up some stuff and you just start bashing on your dad or your mom, or that's not what this is about. Now, they might have done some things that were harmful or hurtful. We need to talk about it, but we want to make it about the person. Okay. And for the most part, I think we struggle as humans to sit with, kind of like what Michael was saying, sit with another person's emotions, especially kids. And we would rather them just kind of get over it as quick as they can, and just kind of be done with it. And so when we talk about how a parent influences a kid emotionally, it can be negatively influenced or positively influenced. And if you think back to parenting styles that we talked about last time, typically authoritarian parenting is a fear-based parenting style, and that's what kids learn. Whereas the indulgent or the kind of non-responsive parenting is another style that kids learn, and they could feel just chaotic all the time. And so there's extremes of it. At the same time, I find that more and more, I am working with more and more adults. Like, I've changed a lot of my practice in the past year to move away from working just with teenagers to working with their parents. And if I can work with them when their kids are like little, like toddler, it's even better. And I've got a really good friend of mine who's awesome at this, teaching parents how to be self-aware of their own emotions when their kids are losing it. Because that happens, y'all know, if you have kids, or if you've seen kids, or you've been around kids, kids lose it. There's a tantrum, someone looked at me wrong, they breathed on me, someone barely brushed by me on the playground. I mean, you know, it's any of those things. And the tears come, or kids are overly aggressive sometimes, and there's an anger kind of inside them that comes out. It not in a good way, right? In more negative ways. And so kids don't have the ability when they're little to have the same coping ability that adults should have. Okay, when kids are younger, they're just starting, like, emotions are just starting to come online. Okay, and if we as adults allow our emotions to, like, if a kid's emotions just are down here and we come down here with them, we're not helping them. Now, that doesn't mean we can't, as adults, we feel the same frustration maybe they feel, or the same hurt, or the same worry, or the same fear, or the same anger. We all feel the same, but how we deal with it is what I mean when we say how parents respond to children's behavior is super important. And we're going to talk more about this at the very end. So having an understanding, most kids by age of 5 or 6, so basically by the time they get in elementary school, realize that emotions need to be controlled or managed some way. And how do they know that? Well, a lot of times there's social development that happens in a school, let's say in a school setting, where, you know, you can't just throw stuff, you know, you can't just you have to have some structure. So they start learning some structure in different ways to try to learn to manage and cope with some of their emotions that they're feeling. Some kids will naturally do this better than other kids. Even if I've even worked with some families where the home was very chaotic, very disconnected, very like unstructured, but the kids were like the stable force emotionally. And I've had the opposite. Home was very structured, not very loving, very connected, but the kids were like, woo, 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 you know, everywhere. I mean, it happens a little bit each way. And so we just know a couple of things for sure, is that kids, as they get older, especially into elementary, they learn to start managing their emotions in some way. And they also start seeing that, hey, they are upset over there, but I'm not upset. Or they're happy over there, but I'm not happy. In other words, they start learning that different people might feel differently than they do at the same time, which sounds like a small thing, but it's actually really important if you think about it, because as a clinician, there's going to be time after time after time where your client is going to be super upset and you're going to feel upset with them, but you still have to realize that you're not as upset as they are, first of all, and you're not in the same place they are. You have to remain as neutral as you can, but also empathetic. So it's kind of like you walk that line. So this week I had a horrible experience where I basically watched the end of a marriage, and it's really painful to watch. And it wasn't like a explosive fight, yelling. It wasn't like that. It was like dissolving. And it's really hard as a clinician to watch something emotional, super emotional, even though there wasn't a lot of weren't a lot of words, right? There wasn't a lot of like action, like throwing things or yelling. It wasn't like that. But watching it, I had to remember that I am the one that's trying to help in some way, or I'm the one that has to be able to know where my emotions are and not allow them to add to someone else's emotion. And we start learning how to do that early in life, like childhood. And it's a natural part of behavior or of learning. Emotional regulation is, I think, a better way of looking at I think it's better to talk a little bit about regulating emotions than it is controlling emotions, because we don't control emotions, but they shouldn't control us. When we're early in life, childhood, elementary especially, in some ways they do have a little bit more control over us when we're younger. And so learning how to regulate emotions is very, very important. And so there's starting to be a lot more like emotion coaching happening now in the clinical, in the mental health world. I saw this the other day online. I think even the Gottman Institute is starting to train emotion coaches for parents or parenting. I don't remember what they call it. I feel like it's for kids, but it's like emotion coaching for parents to understand. I need to look it up and see what it's about, but that's kind of a new thing that's come on board. A lot more schools are taking more like mindfulness approaches to learning, which is, I think, is super helpful, because basically it helps you become self-aware, but also helps you learn how to regulate your thoughts and feelings, which is super important when you're younger. When you have the ability to modulate emotions, it benefits the kids in their relationship with peers. And again, like I said, some kids are able to do that a little bit easier than other kids. The kids that aren't able to modulate the emotions have a little bit more trouble, especially in those early, like elementary into intermediate or middle school years. Some of them just don't do it as well. I think one thing that could be happening, and so we'll couch this in the Chris's theory little bucket. I think one thing that could be happening right now is that we have had a very strong push culturally to be more mindful of emotions and emotional expression, even in childhood, which I think is fine. I think that's good. You know, when I was growing up, most of it, well, first of all, no one ever talked about emotions. That was just like not anything we talked about. Now we talk about them a lot. In almost everywhere we talk about them. But what we don't do is we don't finish our conversation with how to handle it or what to do next. In other words, if I'm talking to somebody, like Christy and I are talking and she's upset, and I say, tell me how you feel, what's going on? And she's like, well, I'm frustrated, and she breaks down and she's crying. And I'm like, well, what's happening? And we talk about it. And then that's it. And I say, hey, go, good luck, and we don't come on the back end and say, let's talk about some ways that we can help regulate or soothe or cope, right? We don't add that component to it. If we don't add that component, then we're just basically without help emotionally, right? So if one of my kids comes to me and they're frustrated at school and they're really upset and they break down and cry, and we talk, and I let them talk, and we validate, we empathize, we do all the things that are good to do. And then I'm like, well, I hope you feel better soon. That's not helpful. You've just let them you've left them wide open without any teaching them how to, what next, right? What's next after I get this out, but you feel better, which is good. Hey, how can I help you now? Like, what did you learn about that situation? Was there anything you would do different about that? How does that feel? How does it feel now? In other words, your emotions feel strong right now, but 10 minutes later, do they feel just as strong? So here's one thing. This is an activity that I do with all my classes. So if you have a piece of paper, or if you're on your computer, you can type, doesn't matter how you do it. But just on a piece of paper on your screen there, and we're going to take about like a minute or two to do this. I want you to write down any emotion that you're having right now within this last, let's say within the last 5 or 10 minutes. Any emotion you're having, it could be any emotion. I want you to write it down. And now we're going to have silence. Hopefully that's okay. Okay, you should have a little bit of a list. It could be one thing, could be 10, I don't know. I'm not gonna worry about how many it is. You start learning early in childhood, and mostly, especially by the time we're talking about late elementary, that you can have multiple emotions at once. You can have different feelings happening at one time. They can come quick. And you can also start to know that certain events are going to cause or lead to certain emotions. You start learning that fairly early, which is actually smart, right? We're wired that way, which is good because it keeps us out of like bad situations. The hard part is it also could keep us out of learning and growing too, because, right, we don't want to always re-experience things that are painful, right? Even if the painful experience wasn't technically like a big experience. I'm not talking about trauma. Okay, we're not talking about traumatic experiences. We're talking about, I fell off my bike, so therefore I don't want to ride my bike again. Like it's things like that, like, oh, I know what that's like, let's don't do that again. That's one of the reasons why as we talked about earlier, a parent's response has a lot to do with how kids kind of learn and deal with their emotions. If your kid falls down and you burst into tears and you're like openly wailing, that's telling them something very specific. Versus if they fall down right in front of you and you're like, you're fine, get up, that tells them something too, right? I mean, all our responses say something. And we learn as people early on, like certain events, we're going to have certain emotional reactions to those events. So keep those lists. We'll come back to that. Okay, let me stop for a second and kind of do like a little check-in. Do you guys have any questions about anything we're talking about, or any thoughts about anything we're talking about? I don't want to gloss over anything, so please let me know if you have any questions about anything.
I kind of have a question. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. So I have worked with families just through a ministry and who have children through foster care or adoption that are struggling with their emotions. And so one of the first things I always do with them is have them look at themselves. So I love that when you said that. I'm like, well, as their anxiety goes up, where does do you go up and match them, or do you come down? Like working
Yeah.
on them to come down when their kids go up instead of rising with them. And there's so much when people come to you with a difficult child, they want you to fix the child. And so when you try to talk to the parent, because they can't control the child, they want to control, they can't physically, I'm just going to hold them down. But they can control themselves. How do you deal with that in a practice? Because it feels like they just want to go find someone else that's going to give them a drug, fix the kid, change it, but not look at themselves. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. I think you're talking about, first of all, that's a very specific population in the adoption world, and depending on the situation and the age of the child when they're adopted and all those things. And so we're going to talk about attachment theory. Well, I might as well talk about it now. I mean, that's an attachment issue. It's an attachment injury more than likely. So
I have 4 adopted children. So
yeah,
I've lived it.
yeah. So let's talk about y'all okay if I talk about attachment real quick? I'm just going to give you like a high view. See, Christy, you're gonna get me on a rabbit trail. That's okay. This good. This good. So in general, attachment theory started with this idea that we were wired. Now, this is way before neuroscience really was a thing. We're talking John Bowlby, we're talking back, early to mid 1900s. And then Mary Ainsworth. I mean, we're talking long ago when the theory started. There's these instances where like kids in orphanages, especially after World War II, where generations of adults were killed, and there were kids. There's just kids, and they would go to these orphanages. And actually, the orphanages weren't necessarily bad. They just didn't have enough people there to work. They had too many kids, and they couldn't get to the kids that were crying quick enough. And what they learned is that some kids, not all of them, but a lot of them would cry. And if you just couldn't get to them, they'd just stop crying. And then some of them would never cry again.
Yeah, I mean, our orphanages are one of the most quiet places you can go. You go where the infants are, and it's dead quiet.
Yeah. So that starts like this idea, what's up with that, right? Well, one of the things we know is that from a detachment theory perspective, when a primary emotion is set off and there's not a connection made, that eventually when that primary emotion is set off again, you won't make an attempt to make a connection. So those babies would stop crying because they just figured out no one's coming. And that's imprinted on their brain forever. Now, that doesn't mean you can't learn to be more securely attached to people. It just means it's really, really difficult because it's an imprint. So if we use the theory in working with people, and I'll answer Christy's question kind of like with this. If you have, let's talk about adults for a second. So I talk to my clients, and I give like a 30-second definition of attachment to them. But if anyone here has ever played hide and seek or tag or chase, right? It's a kid's game. I mean, it's fun. You're playing. Someone's chasing you. You're running and you're trying to get to a base, whatever the base is. Like if you're a little kid, little kids, and you're on one side of the room and that's where base is, but they're on the other side of the room, they'll make something over their base on purpose. I mean, they'll just do that, right? That's a drive. That's not by mistake. That's a drive to be safe. Okay. Adults aren't different. Like in a marriage situation or a family situation, we don't want to run from our spouse, and we don't want to chase them. We want that marriage to be base, right? We want the people in our lives that we love and that love us, we want neurologically, we want that relationship to be safe. Like we're driven towards that, right? And so that's what I mean by safety and security. And that's really what attachment theory is about helping people that feel maybe, let's say, anxiously avoidant. Okay. We still want the attachment, but I'm going to push you away. Sometimes I'm going to push you away just to see if you'll stay. Like, see if you'll stay with me.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So if we have, let's say, in a situation, whether it's an adoption, or I mean, it could even be with your teen
Mm-hmm.
that's older, and let's say they're anxiously, avoidantly, that's their attachment pattern, right? Even if the adult is secure, has a secure pattern, it's two different patterns of attachment that you're working with. But let's make it the adult's anxious, the kid's anxious, both parents are anxious, right? You got anxious attachment happening, right? I'm pushing you away, but I don't want you to go away, right? Does that make sense? So the attachment style that you have has a lot to do with how you feel safe and secure with other people. And it does have a lot to do with your behavior and your responses. And I think I put on Moodle, there's an adult attachment inventory you can take. I think I put it up. Can't remember if I put it up in this class or the other one, but I'll put it up. You can take it. It's super easy to take. It'll tell you a lot of information. But a lot of the emotional development we're talking about comes out of how we attach and how safely and securely we feel attached to, especially the people we love and the people that love us. Does that make sense? Hopefully.
Mm-hmm.
That's like a 5-minute definition of something that's like decades of research. Like I'm still learning about attachment all the time. Does that help at all? Now I haven't answered fully your question, like what do you do with?
Yeah, I mean, because we do talk about attachment a lot, and the term I like to use for children is with parents is felt safety. It doesn't matter that the child is safe; it's do they feel safe? And so the idea of trying to create an environment where there's felt safety for that child. So when the child, and I'm talking about when the child is tantruming, like extreme. I've seen extreme things.
Mm-hmm.
And so when they go up, a lot of times that parent goes up, but what they want. I guess what I'm saying is, like, I liked what you said about the Gottman and doing these emotion coaches and things for parents, but I have found that there's a real, they don't want to look at themselves. They only want to focus on this crazy behavior in the child. And they want you to fix it. So just.
So here's one thing to think about. So one big question that you'll always have if you work with parents is how can I help parents be self-aware? First of all, how can I help parents see that how they, like we said at the very beginning, how parents respond has a lot to do with how kids act. Not all of it, but that has a lot to do with it. That is the number one roadblock that you'll face. And so I've done lots of different things. I learned this one technique from the Whole Brain Child, which is really, I think, a really good, there's actually a workbook that comes with it. I think they do no drama discipline. There's lots of different ones, but if you have a situation between a parent and a child where the kid is upset. Now, full-blown tantrums, this won't work because it's too late. Like like if you think about the brain, right, the frontal part, right, is the impulse control, which they have none. And then the amygdala is inside. So by the time a tantrum happens, they pop their top. I mean, it's you just wait. Pretty much, right? Okay. Before they pop their top, you can do some things. And I've done this with adults too, actually, without them knowing that I've done it. If you have a kid and an adult, and typically what that means just physically is it's more like this, like the adult's taller. I mean, they're just bigger. Well, that right there signals to the brain that, hey, I got, it could be a fight or flight kind of deal, right? So you can actually coach adults to get below their eye line so that the kids above their eye line where the adults looking up. And I've done this with adults too, the same thing. You can try this secretly with your friends and family, and you'll see it makes this kid relax almost immediately physiologically. Now, I'm not talking about when they're like full blown tantrum. That's not the same thing. But as they're getting revved up, getting below their eye line helps. I've done it with couples where in my office, I had the couch was, they don't know this, but the couch is like a little bit higher and my seat's low on purpose. And so I basically spend my whole time underneath them. And when I lean in, I'm even farther underneath because I lean in sometimes when I'm talking to them and I'm even lower than they are. And so that gives a physiological response to your brain, like, okay, wait a minute, everything's okay. I'm okay.
I've seen it, like I've had parents do it shoulder to shoulder. So like if they're really struggling with a kid, to try to fit activities where they're next to them instead of face to face. So if they go to dinner, try to sit next to them.
Yeah.
Or it's
So,
less
and then sometimes it helps to, as you're below them, to say things like, hey, I'm on the same team, or I'm here, or, we're in this together. Or I did that with my kids, so much so that every time we would do it, and especially my daughter, she goes, I know we're on the same team. She would say that, but that's cool. But guess what? They're teenagers now. Guess what they know? We're on the same team. And that's important because what you're doing is you're teaching them emotional regulation. Now, to answer the back half of your question, to help adults, there are some solution focused questions that you can ask people when they're not like when they're struggling with it. Because I don't think fundamentally parents or adults want to do the wrong thing. They want to do the right thing. They just keep doing the wrong thing too many times. They just don't know it sometimes. So if we go into it thinking, oh, these stupid parents are so stupid, why are you doing that? You're not going to have a good result. I mean, you're just going to go into it bad. But if you go into it thinking, how can I let them see this? Or how can I bring out like what they're trying to do? Like when you think about it that way, you can ask questions like sometimes as simple as, tell me how that's working. Is that working for you? And not in a sarcastic way. You can't say it like, well, is that working for you? You can't say that. You can't have a bad tone. You have to have a very curious, kind of non-expert. How's that working? How's that been helpful for you? That throws people for a loop. Like if any of you came to me right now and said, I'm feeling really anxious. And I say, well, how's that helping you? What are you talking about? But it makes you think, right? It makes you change your thought pattern. If you think about how anxiety starts, how it helps you, you're like, okay, wait a minute. It doesn't help me. Or no, maybe it does. You know what I'm saying? Like you're starting to change some thoughts, which is what you're trying to do. You can also ask things like, I hear you saying when this happens, they throw a toy and then what happens for you? What does that feel like for you? Well, I don't like it. Well, yeah. What do you not like about it? Well, they throw their toy and they don't have any respect for my stuff. I hear that all the time. They don't have respect. They don't understand. Well, no, they don't. They're kids. You're an adult, right? How does that make you feel? Well, I don't like it. Well, what do you not like about it? Well, they don't have respect. Help me understand what you mean by respect. What does that mean to you? Well, it means blah, blah, blah. It sounds like you feel angry. Well, I do feel angry. Does it hurt your feelings? Or do you feel like you can't control them? Which is really a lot of times what it is. I'm not in control of them, right? Especially if it's in public and it's what? Embarrassing or what, all those things. And so using some of those are solution focused kinds of questions, basically, where you're just wanting to get them to think differently. You can take a motivational interviewing approach, where motivational interviewing is basically learning about people's values and what they really want, and then helping them go towards those values. Even if they don't want to change, you can actually talk to people about what they want to change without them knowing they want to change. So you can interview them in terms of it sounds like I'm just making this up. It sounds like having order and structure is really important in your house. It sounds like that's super important. Tell me what's important about it. And then all of a sudden we're talking about something different than just the tantrums, and you're literally just trying to help people start thinking differently, right? Because self-awareness is one of the first steps towards emotional maturity and emotional intelligence. Self-awareness is like step one. If you can't have self-awareness, you have a lot of times you have trouble with emotional maturity. So how do you help people be self-aware? You ask questions, right? So, for example, you guys have a list of emotions. I asked you this about 25 minutes ago. So look at your list, okay? Circle the ones you still feel and cross out the ones you don't feel anymore. And if they're the same, you circle them, but circle the ones you still feel, cross out the ones you don't. Did anybody have any you crossed out and that you circled? Probably. That's called self-awareness. You just went through a self-awareness exercise. You're now aware of your emotions. Was that hard or scary or weird or no? What does it feel like?
Chris, I think for me, because I crossed out one and circled another, that it really emphasizes the point that if you'll just take a minute and not respond to the way you're feeling, just be aware of how you're feeling and not respond, that feeling can change pretty quickly and regulate itself. I think a lot of people feel like the moment they feel something, particularly something bad, they have to act on it.
Yeah,
and then that
immediately.
just makes it worse. You're basically feeding the monkeys at that point.
Right.
And yeah, so it's neat exercise.
Good. Anybody else?
Well, I think I've never sat down and kind of looked at my emotions when I'm not feeling in a heightened state, if that makes sense. Like I feel like it's really easy, if I'm extremely stressed or sad or angry or, all of those emotions, I feel like I am more aware, but kind of at a more feeling like neutral. There's nothing that's making me feel a big, strong emotion. I haven't ever looked at, okay, how, like doing an assessment of how am I feeling and realizing, oh, I'm feeling a lot of different feelings right now. So that was interesting. And I noticed some kind of like negative ones went away once I was aware that they were there.
Yeah, sure. Anybody else?
I feel the same thing as Lizzie. I feel like without even knowing, some of the words just went away. Sometimes we maybe give too much attention to the negative emotions, and then they just kind of take care of themselves as like the day goes on,
Yeah.
like the dentist right now calling for like last minute change in the appointment. And I'm like, I'm upset because, I only, have Saturdays off to go to dentist. And I'm like, oh, really? But, it's time goes on. I mean, the class will be over like in 5 minutes. I have plenty of time to go, and it just kind of took care of itself.
Yeah. I do this with clients, same thing. You can do it with thoughts too, by the way. You can do the same thing with thoughts because they change. I could have easily said, hey, write your emotions, write your thoughts. But you can do the same thing because they come and go. Two, the issue that we typically have is that we have trouble untangling thoughts and emotions sometimes. We think they're the same. So that's why today we're kind of like, let's focus on the emotions. So literally we just did a self-awareness exercise. And that's literally all it is. Sometimes we think self-awareness of emotions is like, we have to like be crying maybe, or like angry, or, you don't have to be, like Lizzie was saying. It could be, like right now I feel excited because I like teaching. I like talking about this. So I feel excited and a little bit of joy. But sometimes if I think about, a hard job I'm going to have to do, I feel anxious. I may have a little bit of fear, right? But after that's over, I don't feel fear. I feel something, you know what I mean? So it kind of, they go up and down. Now we're adults that just talked about this, right? And so to ask a kid to do this is a little more difficult. Even an adolescent can be a little bit more difficult, but not impossible. But to kind of going back and circling back to Christy's question, if adults allow a 10-year-old to be in charge of the adult's emotions, that's a problem, right? Just like if a 49-year-old man allows another adult to be in charge of my emotions, that's a problem too. No one's in charge of my emotions but me. Now, that doesn't mean that throughout interactions, I could get upset. My wife and I could get upset because of those interactions, or I have a bad interaction with one of my kids or one of my family members or someone on the road. It doesn't mean in other words, I have to take responsibility for how I'm feeling. It doesn't mean that they're not necessarily involved in, they have influence over. People can have lots of influence over our emotions for sure, and thoughts. But that's not power. I don't want to give them that power. Does that make sense? A 5-year-old is not in charge of my emotional reactions. Or a 10-year-old. I mean, I say this all the time with like middle school, especially middle school. My daughter and I were talking about this yesterday. She had a really bad substitute. This is so bad. 7th grade theater class, like super great group of kids, very demonstrative, like creating their own play right now. This substitute make them sit still and read a book for the whole class period. All because a couple of the kids were like joking around, and I think one of them kind of popped off to her. If you don't have thick skin with middle school kids, you're going to be in trouble. Don't work with middle school kids. Right. So that's what they do. Right? But that's my point, to Christy's point. If we allow ourselves to get to their level, that's always going to be a problem. That's why I always say, how does that work? I lead with that a lot of times. Tell me how that's working. Well, it's not working. Well, I wonder what's happening. And you can reflect back to people what you see. I think what I'm seeing is this happens, and then this happens, and this is what I'm noticing. Is this accurate? Unfortunately, some adults are never going to get to that place where they're going to take responsibility for their own stuff. That's a whole other class. That'd take us forever to talk about.
Dr. Bernard, on that real quick, even on that, it was a great, I just went blank on it, a long word I was going to say, but I can't think of it. But when you're asking about how you're feeling and the emotion that you're dealing with, are you wanting to get them back to understanding the foundation? So like if I'm feeling anxious, if I'm feeling depressed, we're seeing that, you're feeling that, but in reality, it's because of fear or because of anger or because of sadness, loneliness, or whatever. Is that what you're wanting to get back to? Because I remember when I had surgery before for the open heart, the surgeon looked at me and he goes, "Are you okay? How you feeling?" And I said, "Well, I'm anxious." And he goes, "Okay." He didn't like leave it at that. He didn't go, "Well, what's your questions?" He asked me, "So what's your biggest fear?"
Mhm.
And when he was asking me, I go, "Well, here's my biggest fear." And then he was, to your point, able to walk me through, okay, well, let's see if we can calm that down. So is that kind of the point, is you want to get them back to that foundation, that primary emotion, because that's what's triggering the other emotions that
Mhm.
you're seeing or feeling?
Yeah, I'll answer it with this. This is what I was just about to talk about. So this is a great question. I've seen a ton of these examples. This is a really good one, I think, because it's kind of simple. It kind of talks about, Russell, what you're talking about. So you have an event trigger, something happens. Because we're human beings and we don't live in a vacuum. Something's going to happen, right? So you have a primary emotion response pretty much immediately. That can be open heart surgery or someone pulled out in front of me while I'm driving and everything in between. I am an admitted, I unfortunately yell at people while I'm driving. I have a lot, my patience just goes to zero when I'm in a car. I don't know why. I've always been that way. If someone pulls out in front of me, I'm like angry, but I'm not angry first. I'm actually fearful first. That's my primary reaction, right? Then the secondary emotion comes in when you don't feel safe. That's when you express the anger, hatred, numb, or yell, or act out, or going back to Christy's example, those kids, that's where they're going. They don't feel, the primary emotion has not been soothed yet, whatever that is, right? Helplessness is a big one. Hopelessness, fearful, those are huge. Alone, even if they're not alone, right? Even if you're in a crowd of people, you can feel what? Alone. But you're not alone. You're not actually alone. You just feel like you are, right? Like those are big, huge primary emotions. On the flip side of, and if we kind of carry the circle around from the red to the primary emotion, you start attacking, you start criticizing, you start demanding things, you start blaming. Those are just, if you have a primary emotion, your heart surgeon says, "Oh, you'll be fine. Don't worry about it." What are you talking about? I'm not, you know what I'm saying? How dare you, right? But instead, what did he do? What's your biggest fear? He validated you, first of all. He took you to the green down here where there was a connection. Does that make sense? He brought himself, made himself a little bit vulnerable with you, right? Now, at the same time, it wasn't like we're all open wounds and we're just scarred for life kind of thing. It was like that. It was like, no, it probably felt normal. It probably felt good. And if we're honest, he's probably done that a million times. He knows this, he knows what he's doing. So he knows how you're feeling, right? If we go from the event trigger to the primary emotion, which helplessness, hopelessness, fear, all that, but we lead down to an intimacy, we have a connection. Hey, find out what's really going on. Are you just hungry right now? Are you really tired? Are you feeling low? Now you can't necessarily ask all those things, but you can say, "Man, it seems like you're really frustrated," or "Something's happening." Now we're talking about soothing the primary, right? Instead of glossing over it. Now, this is really a lot easier when people are expressive. What's really hard is when people are not as expressive and they don't openly yell or don't openly lash out, but they're still feeling those primary emotions, it's a little bit harder to do. Sometimes that could be maybe they've just bottled their emotions for so long, or kind of put them in a silo for so long, and they're not even aware that they have. You can try this out. This is a weird, goofy exercise, but this stuff, therapists do all the time. You can try this out. Ask people if they know what secondary emotions are, or primary emotions. You can ask them. No one's going to say, yeah, oh yeah, I know what those are. Because we think all emotions are what? The same. They're all the same. And that's not necessarily true. There's some that are primary. And to Russell, to answer your question, as a clinician, I want to help them, not me. I want to help them soothe that primary, right? So if I can teach you how to be aware of it, understand it, find out kind of where it's coming from, and then start talking to it, soothing it, coping with it, man, I've changed your life. I've changed your marriage. I've changed your family. You know what I'm saying? Not me. I'm not saying I'm that important. I'm saying I've helped you learn how to do this so that you can figure it out. And what we know for a fact is that if you had a hard time, if you didn't have someone teaching you how to do that in childhood, you have a hard time as you're an adult teaching your kids how to do it, or other kids or other people. Not that you can't, because this is skill-based. Everything we're talking about here is skill-based, which means you can learn it, you can do it. Like I just taught you guys a skill just today. One little skill you can use over and over and over. You can do this anytime. And the more you do it, the better you get at it, until you're just like, oh, this is where I'm at. I tell my kids all the time, unfortunately, their dad's a therapist, but fortunately for them, they know their emotions pretty well. Now they don't always act, they still make mistakes, they're still kids, and unfortunately for my kids, they don't realize that some of their friends don't get it. Like my son got into this altercation with another kid this week. It got physical. And then my son later the next day went back and said, hey man, I'm sorry about that. And my son said he wasn't very appreciative. The kid's like, my son's 13. I was like, well, bud, some people don't. It's okay. He didn't know what to say. He probably didn't know what to say. Probably no one's ever apologized like that, because my son just felt bad. Now, it didn't rule his life. Like he didn't, well, he just wanted to repair it, right? He didn't want to make a repair attempt. And that's not necessarily always normal. But you have to intentionally teach that too. You have to intentionally teach, how to do those things, because that's important. But I think the last thing that I do want to bring up is there's this great book, and I had it out, and I think it's in my backpack, but Emotional Agility is what it's called. It's a short little book. It's really, really good. This is where I got this, or kind of started looking at emotions as not data, but they're just data, but they're not directives. In other words, they do give us information. Like if you look at your list of emotions, it's information to you, but it shouldn't direct what you're doing. I think, Michael, you said it really well. Like, hey, I looked at this and I'm like, if I just take a beat, I realize that this might change in like 5 minutes or 10 minutes, and I don't have to act upon this right here. A lot of times when I'm working with couples or individuals and they feel a sense of urgency, and I oftentimes ask, hey, do we need to make a decision right now? Which the answer is pretty much always no. That helps people realize that, well, I feel really urgent. I feel really scared right now, but I don't have to make a decision out of fear. Maybe I can wait. I can take a beat. So emotions are data. They're not directives to us. Emotions also have no memory. They only have a context. So you could have an emotion when you're 8 years old, and the exact same emotion when you're 38 years old. Totally different context, totally different I often talk about, and we talk about it in primary emotions. Let's say you're 8 years old and something happens and you feel helpless about it. You could be 38 years old and something happened, you could feel totally helpless. Same emotion, totally different context. Does that make sense? Like the emotion doesn't have a memory, it just has a context that it comes from, right? The reason why I bring that up specifically is a lot of times when people felt the helplessness, you can see it in them when you're talking to them. Like, Christy, I super venture a guess, like some of the parents, like, you feel helpless right now, because they probably do, in some way. Have you ever felt helpless before? You could ask them that. Have you ever felt helpless, and let them talk about it? If you drill down enough, and this happens a lot when I work with men, actually, most typically speaking, stereotypically, this is super stereotypical, but it's true about 85% of the time. The women that I work with, like wives or individuals, can access their emotions a little bit easier than men. And it's not a bad thing. It's just a lot of how we're socialized more than anything. Men can still do it. You just have to work with them a little bit different. But even men, working with them and drilling down to a hopelessness or out of control or a hurt, if you can drill down to, if it was a childhood thing, you can actually then start compare context, not the emotion. You're not comparing the emotions because they're the same. You can compare the context. What's the difference between when you were 8 years old and that happens and you're 38 years old when that happens? Does that make sense? Like, you have a lot more choice over what's going on now. You can choose your reactions better. You can make better decisions. I mean, there's lots of things that are different now. Does that make sense? I mean, you start to really open up this whole lot world of like, wait a minute, this context is different. I feel the same, but the context is really different. We talked a lot today about, yeah, sorry, go ahead, Michael.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but
Oh, you're okay.
Something we've kind of skirted, and I don't know that we've touched on it exactly, but one of the things that I've noticed, and you just brought up men, is that women are a lot more in touch with how all this stuff sits in their body than men are. And I think that when we're talking about awareness of emotions and thoughts, and I really like that you brought up the difference, because I hear so many people say, I feel like you are, and they go into a thought process they have rather than a feeling they actually have. But when these feelings come on, what is the value of working with people to identify what those emotions feel like in their body in the early stages, so that they can proactively self-regulate rather than reactively? Because I know as a man, like, if I'm starting to get angry, my body's starting to tense up before that pop tops, you know, or top pops. So.
Yeah. So I think a couple of things, and we're going to talk about this more, I think, when we get in adolescence, but everybody does experience, everyone does experience, like, say, anger, for example. We have a physiological response to anger. So it takes our bodies in general 20 minutes to relax from anger, physiologically speaking. So the tenseness you feel like in your shoulders, you can ask people, men or women, doesn't matter who, and even teenagers and kids, do you feel tenseness in your back, your neck or shoulder? Do you ever get your hands ever clench? I had a client whose ears got real there. Sometimes they would happen, or their face would get hot. Sometimes people feel it in their stomach, which that happens a lot, or people crunch their toes. I mean, there are physical, I'll call them symptoms of anger. That's especially true of trauma victims, that trauma is experienced in the body. And that's a whole other thing we could talk about. But so to your point, in terms of physiological reactions, it doesn't really matter if you're a man or a woman, you have them. It is just a matter of being aware of them. And most people are aware of them. They just don't know why they're happening until you start talking about it. And so when you start letting them have language and give them a place to have language around why I'm feeling tense or why my fists are clenched or whatever it is, they can start going, oh, wait a minute, I think I'm scared, or I think maybe I feel embarrassed, or, it could be anything like that. I think that most of the reason why men and women respond differently to emotion also, to me, has a lot to do with how they're raised and how they're socialized. Most typically, this is not 100% true, especially now. I think the next 30 years, we're going to see some changes in what I'm about to say. But over the past millennia, it's been a boy falls down, get up, rub dirt on it, move on. A girl falls down, are you okay? Is everything all right? For the most part. That's not 100% true all the way, but generally speaking, that is how men and women are socialized differently in terms of validating what they're feeling, if that makes sense. So really what, Michael, kind of what you're talking about, which we didn't talk about today very much, is how do you validate an emotion, but not validate a behavior, which is a whole different conversation. Because you could feel something, and you could come at me and I can tell that you're upset and I can validate that, but that's not okay to come at me. Right? Which I could go down a whole other rabbit trail. Like, it's okay to agree to disagree, and it's okay to disagree with someone and not be okay with their behavior, but still validate their emotions. That's okay. You can do both. It's okay when we're, but we didn't really talk about that today. But I think that as we can continue on in the class, and especially when we get into adulthood, we'll start talking real specifically about some of these differences, because there are differences in how men and women sometimes express or react to emotions. And a lot of it, to me, and I probably fall in line with more of the I fall more in line with how we develop socially, probably more, a little bit more than how we just the straight evolutionary view. I probably have a little bit of both, but I think our reactions, I think a lot of times are set by the tone of our social setting, I think a lot of times. So, but we're going to talk a lot about that when we get over that. This nurture nature debate doesn't end in childhood. You can talk about it all throughout the whole lifespan. Okay, now we got to stop. Do you guys have any questions about anything that we're talking about? Good questions too, by the way. Really good.
I have one quick follow-up question. Is there a good, like a website or a book to find? I liked when you were talking about like the motivational interviewing and the solution focused like questions.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know of any resource that like lists questions just to kind of?
Yeah, if you Google that, you'll get a million of them. Okay. They're all over the place. The solution focus is super popular. It's been around for a while. Motivational interviewing, same thing. I've got books. I mean, you can get books on it. I mean, it's everywhere now.
Okay.
It's all over. It wouldn't be hard to find. I think I found a list of 100 questions like last fall somewhere, solution focused ones. Super easy to find. So yeah, you can find those. Also with the attachment work, TCU's done a ton of really great research in attachment.
I worked with Dr. Purvis.
Yeah. So
Mm-hmm.
one of the girls I work with, Rachel, she's trained in that. And she actually was in school she was one of our professors. So, but that's,
she was like a child whisperer. She was incredible.
Yeah, it's just because of that trust-based therapy is just so important. Trust-based parenting is by far the best way to go. Mm-hmm. Trusting your kids instead of instilling all fear and guilt into them in the long run is better, because you can't enforce rules without relationship. If you don't have a relationship and they're all of a sudden they're 18. It's like, well, whatever, I'm gonna do whatever I want.
I have a
That's why,
question.
but parents don't like it when kids ask why. That's probably why that happens. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Do you ever use, or do you have clients ask to use the Enneagram?
Sometimes I don't know enough about it. And I tell them, like, if they ask, I don't know enough about it. I know a little bit about it. It's been around actually for a long time.
Mhm.
It's made a kind of a comeback in the last 10 years, probably. I have a lot of friends that use it. I think Dr. Armstrong talks about it in one of his classes, probably all of them. But yeah, I do have clients that same thing with Myers-Briggs, or I mean, like Parenting with Love and Logic, or 5 Love Languages. You know, lots of people gravitate towards things they understand. Strengths Finders, all those are good ones. So I just don't know enough about it to talk about it intelligently. But so I'll just ask, hey, tell me about it, if that makes sense. But yeah, I do have people that ask for sure. Is there a reason why you're asking?
Well, it's actually helped me a lot. It's helped my marriage a lot. It's actually our 14-year-old daughter. She had to take the test at school.
Mhm.
And for her, it's been very enlightening. I don't know that her number's set in stone by any stretch at her age, but
Mhm.
it's helped her become more self-aware.
Mhm.
And then with your number, you go to one number when you're doing well, you're healthy, you're growing, and then you go to another number in stress. And so it's kind of like it introduces red flags if you're headed in the wrong direction. And I just didn't know if you had found it to be helpful for people to learn to become more self-aware, like, oh, I'm headed towards either growth, yay, I'm doing well, or I'm headed the wrong direction, and kind of stopping it before it
Yeah.
gets too far.
I think anything that helps you, you should use. That's my opinion. If something's working, you should keep doing it. My only hesitation about any assessment is none of them are like 100% valid all the time.
Mhm.
That doesn't mean they're not valid. We have to still be able to, like, for example, and this isn't just the Enneagram, I could say this about Myers-Briggs, or like any personality assessment, or I could say this about a lot of assessments that cause us to pause too much when we're going through something hard, let's say, because we go through things that are hard, we're actually learning. You can't learn without making mistakes, basically.
Mhm.
And that's not popular. What I just said is not popular. I was on a phone call yesterday with a CEO of a company that basically asked, how do you help your employees go through change without being uncomfortable? And I was like, well, I said, I think I made a joke, but I said, you can't. You cannot change without being uncomfortable. It's impossible. So I'm not a fan of anything that says, you know, you need to just be comfortable all the time, which I'm not saying. I'm not talking about the Enneagram per se with that. I'm just saying in general, like, being uncomfortable is how we learn. In some ways, suffering is growth.
Mhm.
Now, I'm not advocating we go and suffer. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is we can't really learn really well unless we fail. Hopefully that makes sense. It doesn't come across weird. That's super unpopular. What I just said is not what my clients don't want to hear. That people don't want to hear, you know, you're probably going to fail like 100 times. Oh, maybe 200 times. People, if you lead with that, people are like, well, I'll turn you off. I'm not coming back to you. You know, my gosh, how many times have you failed in your life? I mean, you know, that's just part of life. So, but I think things like the Enneagram, Myers-Briggs, the other things I mentioned, if that helps you and if that helps you grow, I think it's great. I think you should use it. Absolutely. I think it's good. I think it's a good thing. I find that the Enneagram, this is interesting. I'd love to know. I need to probably think about this. I find that the Enneagram has become more popular in Christian circles than it was when I first experienced it like 10 or 12 years ago. I've just seen that. Maybe that's because of the area of the country we live in too. I don't know. That's interesting. I think there's probably some connection there somewhere, but
I also wanted to say that the emotion wheel behind you, they actually have a pillow.
oh,
We
do
use
they?
that. Yeah, we use that in family therapy. And so we're big fans of that wheel behind you.
Well, it's a great, I use it all the time and I hand it out all the time. And what's great about online therapy now is I can pop it up on the screen and we can talk about it. I use this one too with kids all the time. You can do this one, and I have the anger kind of one too. This one gets a whole different reaction usually from people. But yeah, the emotion wheel is really helpful. So
And then I want to ask just a quick question. You said, how do you validate the emotion without validating the behavior?
that's what I was
So-
saying. That's a whole other conversation. Yeah.
Can I just give like a quick example of what I think
Sure.
was that?
Yeah.
So
sure.
so we adopted our youngest and we've had him 5 years tomorrow. And after the fact, we found out he's on the spectrum. So it's just been a journey for our whole family. We have 2 older children and our 11-year-old son this last week, he had been gone like at a slumber party and he came back and he was just immediately irritable with our youngest. And so it was just like, buddy, I mean, come on, like you haven't been home 5 minutes. And he got real quiet and he said, well, I'm sorry, but it's just really hard for me to walk back into this. That kind of knocked my socks off because I thought that was really well stated. And I could empathize with that. And so I really didn't know what to say at first because I was just almost blown away at how well he expressed himself. But then I celebrated in a sense of what he said and said, I get that. I totally get that, but you can't bite his head off. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Yeah, I would even go a step further. Like when you say, I didn't know what to say at first. First of all, that's okay. I think it's okay to say, I don't, man, that's really great.
It was a
Like, you
little
don't-
bit of a proud mom moment, like, wow,
Yeah,
that was
you don't,
okay.
you know, we don't have to say anything sometimes. Sometimes that's okay. I think if we can get to a place where we can, like with him in this situation, say, yeah, it does seem like you're irritated. And just kind of leave it. Because that's what he feels irritated or whatever it is, whatever's going on.
Yeah.
And then we can get to the whole behavior piece on the back end, as we validate first. Right. So if you come to me and you're saying, I'm just making this up. You're coming to me and I can tell by the way you're talking, you're frustrated or you're upset or whatever it is. And I say to you, golly, you need to take a step back. You need to chill. That's one way. And you can do that. Or if I say, it sounds like you're frustrated right now or something's going on. Can you help? What's happening? Well, I've immediately validated your emotion. Right. And you're more likely to keep talking, which is good. And you're talk about what's going on. That sounds really difficult. And all I'm doing is I'm not doing anything. I'm just listening and validating what you're saying. And you keep doing that. And as you calm and you feel validated, then I can say, I think it just took me off guard because you kind of were aggressive with me. Or whatever, I know you're irritated. It seems like you were taking it out on your brother, or I know it must be difficult to be in this house sometimes. Sometimes I struggle with it. I think we all do. Help me understand what's hard for you. Because then you're having a conversation about like validating and having a conversation for him that's focused on him. Because he's probably also saying, I don't feel like I'm very focused on very much. Right. He's like, I don't know if am I important? Because I'm important at my friend's house, which is not true. What I'm saying? This isn't true. It's not true. Yeah. He's obviously important. You're sitting there going, oh my gosh, that's so awesome. You know what I'm saying? But in his mind, this goes back to what we were saying earlier. He felt primarily alone,
Yes.
which is not true, right? So when you validate the aloneness and you say, golly, yeah, you must feel like you're maybe pushed to the side sometimes, and he might even say, no, I don't feel that. That's okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense what I'm saying?
I followed up with him later, like when, you know, the mood had settled, if you will, and it was just he and I on the couch, and just really, again, validated what he was feeling. But then he is just a super mature kid. And so I was also able to just stress the importance of our youngest for this to be a safe place for him, because of the struggles that he has with being on the spectrum. And so, and he can understand that enough, but sometimes, you know, it's his own emotion that can cloud it. So
Yeah, I think what I would say, honestly, my suggestion would be take him out somewhere, just you and him, and just hang out with him
yeah,
and just put your attention on him. The hard part of what you're talking about is that it could be someone on the spectrum. It could be other things too. It could be someone that's struggling, like one kid in particular struggling really, really at a certain time for a certain amount of time, let's say, can have the same kind of reaction where when my son was struggling in school and we had to get him tutors, and then we kind of found out about ADHD and then some anxiety, and it was like the better part of 6 or 8 months of like, zero, my daughter's over here doing awesome in school and has friends, and we're like, she's on autopilot, and then one day she's crying and I'm like, what just, and we were like, she's like, well, you guys love Kate more than me. Well, there's nothing worse than that as a parent, and we're like, but instead of getting offensive and saying, what do you mean that's crazy? I'm like, you feel like we're spending more time with your brother. It's like, yeah, but that's, what I'm saying? It's like, that's part of what Christy was saying earlier. If we're self-aware of what's going on for us, we don't get defensive and we don't like jump to conclusions and, blow up everywhere. Now inside we might be going nuts, right? Like we're, crazy with worry or fear, whatever it is, anything you do, first of all, you didn't do anything wrong. You're a good parent. That's the first thing. You're not doing anything wrong. Okay. Your son being able to express that tells me that you guys are intentional about that. And that right there is going to serve him well in his life forever. Like not just now, and he didn't do that by accident. You helped him do that. You know what I'm saying? This isn't like we can just set our kids into the world and don't give them any training. And that's not what this is. This is intentional. I think just the situation of your family is probably somewhat of what's going on.
sure.
A year from now, it might not, what I'm saying? It won't be any of those things, if that makes sense. I know I've talked too much, but that's a good question. But validating the emotion is number one, but you don't have to accept the behavior. Hey, I know you're upset. I wonder if we can think of a different way. Is there another way? I've got kids that are 15 months apart, and boy and a girl, and they're totally different, and they fight all the time. And they say horrible things, and we don't talk to them like that. You know what I'm saying? And they, crazy stuff, and they get on video games together and they argue. I mean, they're just arguing all the time, and they're always like, you can't do that.
Right.
You can be upset all you want, but where's you know what I mean? Like, how do you put the boundary there in the structure? So
I was just going to say an interesting thing in my household, because we've had similar, having 4. You might think about, for the next week, every time you're handling a situation with that difficult child, where is your son? Just try to get his perspective for a week in your mind, and then think about it. Like, is he in the house? Is he listening to this? Is he alone? just to become aware, what's his perspective? What is he, because we had some of that with one of my older ones, and we just didn't realize how lonely he was.
Yeah,
And I
we've
think
definitely, I mean,
Yeah, that's going to happen.
we've been in therapy for 5 years. So
Yeah.
it's a lot of work, and yeah.
Well, you're doing a great job.
Well, thank you. We're thankful for therapy.
Well, listen, therapy is only an hour a week. You got the other 167. You're doing a good job.
Thank you.
So whatever you're doing, just keep doing it. And guess what? We're all going to screw up. And I mean, gosh, we're not perfect. It's just going to, I told my son that this week we were driving. He was all mad. I was like, you know what, bud? Because we had taken his phone and his Xbox. And that's like, the world just ended and
Mhm.
everything's worse. And I'm like, we mess up, dude. I'm sorry. We're not perfect, but it's what we got. I mean,
I heard a quote once, and the guy, he relates it to being a leader, but I just put parent where he says leader. And he says people want to follow people that are always real instead of always right.
yeah, that's right.
And so I very much allow our kids to see me make mistakes and then apologize for them.
Yeah. And that's the key there is when you apologize and you're always teaching them something. You can't, just like you can't not communicate, you can't not teach because they're looking at you.
Mm-hmm.
Especially the older they get. And then they get really brutal, man.
Yes.
Well, you're doing that. How come I can't do it? Whoa, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
So, all right,
There's,
listen. Yeah.
Oh, I was
Sorry,
going to
go
say
ahead,
real
Lizzie.
quick. So I don't know, you've probably heard of Brene Brown, but she's,
Oh, yeah.
so I love her. And she's put out a podcast and she talks about armored leadership. So being a knower and being right, and then daring leadership, being a learner and getting it right.
Mm.
She put out the first part, and I listened to it, and she had some really good perspectives of just kind of, I mean, like you were saying, like interchanging leader with parent, of knowing and being right versus like, okay, I'm going to learn from this and learn how to get it right instead of, dare to lead.
That's her book.
Yep.
Yeah. This is, as my mom, who's been in the business world for 35 years, she said, this is a bunch of foo-foo. Because she kind of came up in the 60s and 70s where, well, especially as a woman, it's like, there was no soft skills. Well, this is all soft skills because that's our world now, soft skills. So, and the podcast is awesome. Anytime you can, she has some great TED Talks too that are really good. So,
yeah. So,
all right.
Sorry to continue.
No, you're
too
great.
long.
No, that's great. Hey guys, y'all have a good weekend.
You too.
Thanks,
And
you too.
I'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Thank you.
All right, bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.